A young white woman adopts 16 black children. What happened years later is beyond imagination. Elena arrived in Mozambique with a heart full of hope and excitement. She was only 21 years old, but she had already made a big decision to leave her home in Sydney and volunteer at an orphanage for a month. Her suitcase was packed with school supplies, clothes, and a strong belief that she could make a difference in the world. She dreamed of helping children in need, and she couldn't wait to get started. But when she first set foot in the orphanage, the reality that greeted her was far darker than she could have ever imagined. The orphanage was old and falling apart. The walls were dull gray and barely standing, and the place looked neglected. Elena had expected to hear children laughing and playing, but instead she was met with an eerie silence. She looked around, expecting to see kids running around and having fun, but all she saw were muted whispers and fearful looks. The children seemed to be staring blankly at her, their eyes full of sadness and fear. Elena's heart sank. Something wasn't right. The orphanage's director, an older man with a cold expression, gave her a brief tour of the building. As they walked through the halls, Elena noticed many unsettling details. She saw torn clothes scattered on the floor, children with vacant stares, and staff members who barely acknowledged her presence. It wasn't the warm, welcoming place she had imagined. Elena was beginning to feel uneasy, but she didn't want to jump to conclusions. She was determined to help, so she pushed her feelings aside and tried to focus on the children. It didn't take long for Elena to realize that things were much worse than they appeared. Just a few days after arriving, Elena began to see signs that something was terribly wrong. The children weren't being fed properly. Many of them looked pale and sickly, their thin bodies and sunken eyes showing clear signs of malnutrition. Elena had expected to see happy, healthy children, but instead, she was confronted with the sad reality of their suffering. She tried asking the staff about it, but their responses were always vague and evasive. They didn't seem to care about the children's well-being, and that bothered Elena deeply. Something was definitely wrong, but no one would tell her the truth. Elena started to observe the staff more closely. She noticed that some of the volunteers and workers seemed to have no interest in the children at all. In fact, they often left the orphanage in the evenings, riding expensive motorcycles and wearing fancy clothes, while the children were left behind with barely enough to survive. Elena couldn't understand how people who were supposed to help could be so indifferent to the suffering of the children. It didn't make sense, and she knew she had to find out more. One afternoon, Elena heard a muffled sob coming from the back of the orphanage. She followed the sound and found a small room at the end of the hallway. The door was slightly open, and inside she saw a young child, no older than 5, curled up in the corner, crying softly. His clothes were stained and dirty, and when he looked up, Elena saw bruises on his neck and arms. They didn't look like they had been caused by a simple fall. Elena's heart broke as she realized just how deep the abuse went. She kneeled down beside the boy and whispered, "Are you okay?" He didn't respond. He just stared at her with wide, fearful eyes. Elena could feel her anger rising. How could anyone treat a child this way? She knew she had to do something. That night, after everyone else had gone to bed, Elena decided to investigate on her own. She quietly made her way to the director's office. The door was locked, but Elena was determined to find answers. She managed to pick the lock and slip inside. What she found in the office shocked her to her core. There were falsified reports, fake documents that hid the truth about the orphanage's conditions. She found money transfers that didn't match the donations the orphanage had received. And she found letters promising improvements to the orphanage that never came. It was all a lie. The orphanage wasn't using the money to help the children. Instead, it was being stolen, and the children were paying the price. Elena's mind raced as she put the pieces of the puzzle together. The expensive clothes, the motorcycles, the indifferent staff, all of it pointed to a network of corruption, a system that was exploiting the children for profit. Elena couldn't believe what she was seeing. She felt a mix of shock, anger, and fear, but she also knew she couldn't stay silent. The children needed her, and she had to act. The next day, Elena found a quiet moment to talk to one of the volunteers who had been working at the orphanage longer than she had. His name was Mark, and he was in his 30s. Elena had seen him around the children, and he seemed to genuinely care about them. She felt she could trust him, so she decided to tell him what she had discovered. "Mark," she said quietly, "I need to talk to you. I think something is really wrong here." Mark looked at her with a cautious expression but nodded. They went to a secluded area of the orphanage, away from the prying eyes of the staff. Elena told him everything she had found, the abuse, the corruption, the stolen money. She didn't know who she could trust, but she had to tell someone. "I found proof that they're stealing the donations," Elena said, her voice trembling. "The kids are being neglected, and no one is doing anything about it. We have to do something." Mark was silent for a moment. Elena waited, her heart pounding in her chest. Finally, he spoke. "Elena," he said, "I've been here a long time, and I've seen it all. What you've discovered is just the tip of the iceberg. This goes much deeper than you think. The authorities are involved. The people who should be helping these kids are the same ones who are taking advantage of them." Elena's heart sank as she listened to Mark. She had hoped that maybe he would have a solution, but instead, it seemed like the problem was even bigger than she had imagined. She felt overwhelmed, but she also knew that she couldn't walk away. She couldn't leave the children to suffer while everyone else turned a blind eye. She had to make a choice, either to stay and fight or to leave and forget what she had seen. But Elena couldn't do that. She had come to Mozambique to help these children, and she wasn't going to give up on them now. 5 years later, Elena was no longer the young, hopeful woman who had arrived in Mozambique. The orphanage had finally been shut down after numerous complaints and investigations, but Elena couldn't walk away. 9 of the children she had cared for had nowhere to go. They would be thrown onto the streets if she didn't help them. Elena knew she couldn't leave them behind, so she made a decision that would change her life forever. One rainy night, Elena gathered the children together and whispered, "Let's go." With nothing but the clothes on their backs and a few belongings, Elena took the children to her small house on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. The house was barely big enough for Elena, let alone 9 children, but Elena didn't care. She couldn't leave them to suffer. She was all they had. Life became very difficult for Elena. She woke up early every day to make breakfast for the kids. She spent her days looking for ways to get food and clothes for them. Sometimes there wasn't enough money and they barely had enough to eat. Elena worked hard to keep them safe, but it was a constant struggle. She didn't always know how she was going to make it through the next day, but she never gave up. She couldn't. Elena's friends in Australia didn't understand. They called her and asked, "What are you doing? You can't take care of all these kids by yourself. What are you going to do when the money runs out? What about your life?" Elena listened to their concerns, but she knew deep down that she couldn't leave. She couldn't walk away from the children who needed her. "I don't know what I'm going to do," Elena said, "but what I do know is that I can't leave them. They've been through so much already. If I don't help them, no one will." Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. Elena's life became a daily battle. She worked harder than she ever had before, but the emotional toll was even greater than the physical one. Each child had been through so much pain and suffering, and Elena felt their pain deeply. But she never stopped caring for them. Elena tried to be strong for the children, but sometimes in her small room with the door closed, she cried quietly. She had doubts. Was she doing the right thing? Was she really helping or just making things worse? But every morning when the children woke up and looked at her with hope and love, the doubts went away, at least for a while. They were the reason she kept going, the reason she kept fighting. Elena knew the road would be hard, but she also knew she couldn't stop trying. Elena had given up a lot, but in her heart, she knew it was worth it. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, the children had a chance. Elena was determined to make sure that chance didn't slip away. As the years passed, what started as an idea to help 9 children grew into something much bigger. Elena started a group called Hope for Tomorrow to help children who had no one to care for them. She didn't have big donations or support, but she believed that she could make a difference. The group's name wasn't just a name. It meant exactly what Elena wanted to give those children: hope for tomorrow. Even though things were hard at the beginning, Elena kept moving forward. She found a way to take care of more children, giving them food, shelter, and love. Elena walked the streets of Mozambique looking for children who had been forgotten by the world. Every time she saw a child, it made her sad, but it also made her more determined to help. She couldn't save all of them, but each child she saved was one less child living in misery. One day, Elena found a group of children sitting around a fire. Their clothes were torn, and they were very hungry. One child, a boy named Quito, stood apart from the others. He looked lost and like he had given up. Elena walked slowly toward him, not wanting to scare him. "Hi, what's your name?" Elena asked, kneeling to be at his level. At first, Quito didn't say anything. He just looked at her with sad eyes. Elena smiled and said, "My name is Elena. I help children like you." Quito looked up at her with pain in his eyes, and then he whispered, "My name is Quito." "Are you alone?" Elena asked. Quito nodded, but didn't speak. Elena could see he didn't believe anyone could help him, but she wouldn't give up. She asked, "Would you like to come with me? I can take you to a safe place where you won't have to worry about food or sleeping on the streets." Quito looked at the other children and then back at Elena. He didn't move. Elena smiled softly and said, "You don't have to decide now. I'll be here if you change your mind." 2 days later, Quito came to Elena's house. His face was dirty and his eyes were full of tears. He didn't say anything but just looked at her. Elena knew then that he had started to trust her. She let him in and treated him like one of her own children. Over time, Quito got stronger. Elena continued to find children in need. Many of them were alone and had no future. Hope for Tomorrow grew bigger and bigger, and Elena took in as many children as she could. She became the legal guardian of 16 children. Some of them had been in terrible situations with no one to help them. Life wasn't easy for Elena. She worked hard to manage the group and get enough money to feed and educate the children. Sometimes she felt so tired and wondered if she could keep going. But every time she looked at their faces, full of gratitude and hope, she found the strength to keep going. One of the hardest times was when a girl named Anaya got very sick. Elena rushed her to the hospital, but the doctors weren't sure she would survive. The doctor said, "We will do what we can, but prepare yourself for the worst." Elena couldn't hold back her tears. She stayed by Anaya's side, holding her hand and praying. For days, Elena waited, hoping Anaya would get better. It was slow, but Anaya did get better. Elena was so grateful. It was a painful reminder of how fragile the children's lives were and how much they needed her to keep going. Elena kept working, even though it was hard. She knew she wasn't alone. The children she had saved needed her, and she was willing to do anything to help them. Hope for Tomorrow wasn't just an organization anymore. It was a family. It was a family that Elena had built with love, sacrifice, and hard work. Elena's home was full of love, but it was also full of the invisible scars the children carried. Some of the children had been through very hard things. Sometimes the pain from their past caused trouble. One of the hardest cases was Amara. Amara was only 10 years old when Elena found her. She had seen her mother be killed by a gang, and her father had disappeared. Amara was lost, scared, and didn't trust anyone. She was so afraid that she didn't know how to feel safe. When Amara first came to Elena's home, she was angry and upset. She would scream at the other children and push them away. Elena tried to help her, but Amara didn't trust anyone. One day, after a fight, Elena took Amara aside. "I know you're scared," Elena said gently. "I know you've been through things no child should ever go through, but I'm here to help. No one will hurt you here." Amara looked at Elena with anger and pain in her eyes. "You don't know anything," she shouted. "No one can help me." Elena felt sad, but she didn't give up. She couldn't make Amara trust her, but she could show her that she was safe. At night, Amara would have bad dreams, and Elena would go to her room to comfort her. Elena stayed by her side even when it was hard. One day, Amara had a huge outburst. She threw a toy against the wall and screamed. Elena rushed to her and said, "I'm not going to leave you. You're not alone." Amara didn't scream anymore, but she was still crying. Slowly, her sobs stopped. For the first time since coming to Elena's home, Amara let Elena hug her. It was a small step, but it was very important. Amara was starting to trust Elena little by little. The next weeks were still hard, but that hug meant a lot. Elena knew it would take time for Amara to heal, but she was determined not to give up on her. Amara had the right to take back her childhood and feel safe again, even though the world had shown her its worst side. The other children in the house started to notice the changes in Amara little by little. The wall she had built between herself and the others began to come down. It wasn't easy, and there were setbacks, but Amara started to join in small moments of play with the other children, though always from a distance. Each time she did, Elena felt a small spark of hope. Elena knew that these small steps, even though they seemed tiny, meant that Amara was starting to heal. But Elena couldn't stop feeling overwhelmed by responsibility. Each child she cared for had a painful story, and Amara wasn't the only one with a sad past. Some of the other children had trouble adjusting, and others kept their sadness inside. Elena wondered if she was doing enough for them. She often felt full of doubt when she was alone, but she never showed that in front of the children. She had to be strong for them, even when she felt like breaking down. One afternoon, while Elena was making dinner, Amara quietly came into the kitchen. It was unusual for the children to be near her during that time because they were usually busy with play or chores. Elena turned around, surprised to see Amara standing there, watching her with an expression she didn't understand. "Do you need something, Amara?" She asked, trying to sound casual. The girl stepped closer but didn't speak at first. After a long silence, Amara finally whispered, "Thank you for not leaving me alone." Elena felt her heart break and heal at the same time. She didn't say anything right away. Instead, she moved closer to Amara and hugged her. This time, Amara didn't pull away. It was a small victory in the middle of all the struggles. Elena knew that Amara's healing would take time, but for the first time, Elena felt that they were making progress, even if it was slow. When Ava came into Elena's life, it marked a new chapter with even more emotional challenges. Unlike the other children Elena had helped, Ava was 17 and carried an emotional burden so heavy it seemed impossible to let go of. It was clear that Ava had gone through unimaginable pain, but for the first few months in the house, she refused to talk about her past. She built a wall around herself that no one could break, and her silence made the house feel tense. From the very first day, Ava avoided any contact with the other children and stayed alone in the corners. While the others began to form bonds, Ava remained distant, as if their happiness only reminded her of her own sadness. Elena watched her with concern, knowing Ava was struggling with something too painful to talk about. Elena tried to reach out to Ava, but every time she was met with indifference or rejection. Ava seemed to always be on guard, as if she was afraid that any act of kindness would only lead to more hurt. One afternoon, Elena sat beside Ava at the dining table and said softly, "I don't want to pressure you to talk, but I want you to know I'm here. You don't have to go through this alone." Ava didn't say anything. The silence stretched on for what felt like forever. Finally, Ava stood up without saying a word and went to her room. Elena felt frustrated. She knew Ava's recovery would be slow, but seeing the pain on her face and not being able to help was heartbreaking. Months passed and Ava's behavior didn't change. She stayed isolated, and the other children began to avoid her. Some were even scared of her because of how distant and quiet she was. But Elena never gave up. She knew Ava needed help, even though she wasn't asking for it. Then, one day, everything changed. Ava had a breakdown that shocked everyone. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon, and the house was calmer than usual. Ava was outside, as always, alone while the younger children played nearby. Then, one of the little ones, not noticing her, accidentally bumped into Ava. What happened next was an explosion of emotions that had been hidden for so long. "Don't touch me!" Ava shouted, pushing the child so hard he fell to the ground. Her voice echoed through the house. Elena ran outside and saw Ava trembling with anger and fear. Ava had her hands over her face, sobbing uncontrollably. The other children stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Elena carefully approached Ava, not wanting to make things worse. "Ava, please look at me," Elena said softly. "You're not alone. I'm here with you." Ava continued crying, and Elena didn't know whether to move closer. After what felt like forever, Ava lowered her hands from her face, and her eyes showed deep pain. "I can't take it anymore," she whispered. "I can't keep living with this inside me." Those words were the first sign that Ava was ready to begin talking about her pain. With a heavy heart, Elena led Ava inside, away from the other children, and held her while she cried. For the first time, Ava let herself be vulnerable. Through her sobs, Ava began to speak. "In the shelter," she said with a broken voice, "one of the workers there, he did horrible things to me. He told me that if I spoke, he would hurt me more." Elena felt her body tense as she listened to Ava. The horror of what she had been through made Elena feel both angry and sad. "It wasn't Ava's fault," Elena told her, hugging her tighter. "None of this is your fault," Elena said. "What he did is wrong, and I'll do everything I can to make sure you get the help you need. You're not alone." Ava's path to recovery was long, and it wasn't easy. Elena knew she couldn't help Ava alone, so she found a therapist who worked with trauma. At first, Ava didn't want to talk about what had happened, but with the help of the therapist and the safe space Elena tried to create, Ava slowly started to open up. Some days, Ava seemed to take steps backward, falling into long silences and isolation. But Elena was patient and always there for her. She never pressured Ava, understanding that healing would happen at her own pace. Nights were the hardest. Ava often had nightmares about the abuse she had suffered in the shelter. Elena would sit by her bed, waiting for her to calm down. Sometimes Ava would wake up screaming, and Elena would hold her, assuring her she was safe. "He can't hurt you anymore," Elena would say, even though she knew it was hard for Ava to believe. The therapist worked hard with Ava, helping her process the trauma and find ways to cope with the pain. Even though the progress was slow, Elena celebrated each small victory. Over time, Ava started interacting more with the other children, though she still kept an emotional distance. Her relationship with Elena also began to change. Ava started to trust Elena more, and Elena realized that although Ava's recovery would take a long time, she was no longer alone. They had taken the first step together, and that was a triumph. Elena's days were filled with responsibilities that seemed never ending. While she gave everything to the children, she also struggled with her own exhaustion. For years, she had put the children above her own needs, but now she was feeling the weight of that responsibility. She was physically tired, but it was the mental strain that really affected her. She began to question if she could keep going and if she could handle everything. Sometimes, after the children went to bed, she would cry alone in her room, not because she was weak, but because it was the only way to release the emotions she had been holding in. At first, Elena's friends and family in Australia supported her, but over time, they started to worry. Her mom told her, "Don't you think you should think about yourself for a moment? You can't keep going like this forever. It's consuming you." Elena knew her mother was right, but she couldn't just leave the children. She felt guilty at the thought of abandoning them. Who would take care of them if she wasn't there? The guilt trapped her in a cycle she couldn't escape. Elena worked hard to raise money for the organization she ran, but the funds were never enough. For 9 months of the year, she lived with the children in Mozambique, taking care of them and making sure they received an education and emotional support. For the other 3 months, she returned to Sydney to raise money through charity events. Those 3 months were both a relief and another burden. While in Australia, Elena could clear her mind, but the pressure to raise money for the next year weighed heavily on her. At charity events, she was admired for her work, but no one really understood the life she lived. When the events were over, Elena was left alone, facing a reality that no one could imagine. One night after a charity event, Elena returned to her small apartment in Sydney. The event had been a success, but instead of feeling happy, she felt empty. She collapsed on the sofa, overwhelmed by exhaustion. The pressure to keep everything going, to be the support for so many children, was crushing her. She knew something had to change, but she didn't know where to start. Elena had always been strong and determined, but things were starting to get harder for her. She was feeling very tired, and the little things she used to remember were slipping her mind. Her patience with the children sometimes ran out faster than she wanted. Plus, the constant worry about money kept her awake at night. Elena, who had always managed to handle everything, was now at a crossroads. She felt like she couldn't keep going, even though she loved the children she cared for. One morning, after a really tough night, Elena decided she needed help. She couldn't ignore what was happening anymore. While staying in Sydney, she called a therapist that a close friend recommended. At first, she wasn't sure about talking to someone, but she felt she had no other choice. She needed to open up to someone who would listen and not judge her. "It's hard to say, but I need help," Elena said quietly in her first session. "I love those kids, but I don't know if I can keep going like this." The therapist listened closely and let Elena talk about everything she had been keeping inside. Elena told the therapist about her fear of failing, about feeling like she wasn't good enough for the children, and how lonely and stressed she felt. She also shared how hard it was to raise money to take care of them and how trapped she felt in her life. The therapist told Elena, "It's normal to feel overwhelmed. You're carrying a big responsibility, and it's okay to feel exhausted. The important thing is to ask for help when you need it. You don't have to do everything alone." These words made Elena feel a little better. She had always been the strong one, the one who did everything by herself. But now she understood she couldn't do it all alone. During the next few months in Sydney, Elena worked on taking care of herself, learning how to manage her emotions, and finding small moments just for her. When Elena returned to Mozambique, she was still tired, but she felt a little stronger and more ready to face the challenges ahead. She knew the work was hard, but she had learned that asking for help was okay. Back at the house in Mozambique, Elena was welcomed by the children who rushed to greet her. She felt both happy and scared. Happy to be back with them, but scared that things would get too hard again. But this time, Elena had learned not to let the pressure of everything take over. She knew she couldn't carry everything alone, even though she was the heart of hope for tomorrow, the home for the children. Elena kept helping the children grow and change their lives. When the children came to her home, many of them had tough lives. They didn't have much hope for the future, and some had lived on the streets or in orphanages. But everything changed when they arrived at Elena's home. Elena gave them more than just food and a place to stay. She gave them hope for a better future, an education, and a second chance. One of the first children Elena found was Camille. He was only 9 years old when Elena found him alone on the cold streets after his mother had died. He was scared and hungry, and he didn't speak to anyone. When Camille came to Elena's house, he didn't talk to anyone. He was very quiet and withdrawn. Elena didn't give up on him, though. She spent time helping him with his homework and teaching him. Slowly, Camille began to trust her. He started to believe in himself, and after a lot of hard work, he became one of the best students in his class. Elena was so proud of him. Another child, Matteo, had an even harder start. He was 11 years old when Elena found him digging through trash for food. He hadn't eaten in days and was very weak. When he came to Elena's house, he didn't talk much either. But over time, Elena noticed something special about him. One day, while the other children played soccer in the yard, Matteo decided to join. Even though he was small and thin, he was amazing at soccer. He was quick and skillful, and everyone was impressed. Elena didn't know much about soccer, but she found a way for Matteo to practice more and even joined a local soccer team. Matteo's talent grew, and soon he was playing in a big soccer academy. Matteo's story was one of many. Other children at Elena's house discovered their own talents, whether it was in art, music, or science. What once seemed like a hopeless future for these children became a future full of possibilities. Elena had created a home where children didn't just survive, they thrived. Even though Elena still faced tough times, the progress she saw in the children gave her the strength to keep going. The hard work was worth it because each smile, each small success reminded Elena that she was doing the right thing. Over the years, she saved 16 lives, each one showing that with love and support, anything was possible. One of the hardest times for Elena was when she met Luca. He had been abandoned when he was just 2 years old. His life had been full of pain, violence, and sadness. By the time he was 16, he had been through things no child should ever face. He didn't trust anyone and didn't know how to be part of a family. Elena had to work hard with him because he didn't want to follow the rules, and he often ran away. But over time, she helped Luca trust again, and he began to heal. Elena had helped so many children who had been through so much, and she had changed their lives forever. Even though the road was hard, Elena knew she was doing something important. Elena lived a life that many would find difficult to imagine. Every night when the house quieted down and the children she cared for were asleep, she would sit in silence, exhausted from a long day. Despite the weight of the responsibilities she carried, she never gave up. Elena knew that behind the tough outer shell of one of the children, Luca, there was a broken heart. Luca was a boy who had experienced a lot of pain in his life, and he didn't trust anyone. But Elena saw something in him. She knew that, if given the right help and care, he could change his life. At first, Luca didn't want to open up. He pushed people away and always tried to act as if nothing could hurt him. Elena never gave up on him. She patiently waited for him to come around, and slowly she began to see a change. One day, after much thought, Elena decided to take action. She enrolled Luca in a local boxing gym. Elena believed that boxing might help Luca release the anger and frustration that had been building up in him for years. She thought it might teach him discipline and give him something positive to focus on. To everyone's surprise, Luca was a natural at boxing. He had a strength and agility that made him stand out among the other young boxers. But more than his physical talent, boxing taught him something even more valuable: discipline and purpose. Every punch he threw in the ring was more than just a move to win a match. It became a way for Luca to let go of the pain he had carried for so long. Slowly, he started to change. He began to act more respectfully at home and followed the rules. He also started to engage more with the other children in the house. Boxing had awakened a new side of Luca, and it helped him transform into a better version of himself. Elena's house was also filled with music. She loved to play music while cooking or cleaning, and one day, Luca discovered an old guitar that Elena had found in a thrift store. At first, Luca didn't know how to play the guitar. He strummed a few out-of-tune chords, but Elena encouraged him to keep trying, and try he did. Luca spent hours in his room, practicing until he became quite good. His passion for music grew, and soon he was writing his own songs. Music became a way for Luca to express his feelings. He poured his emotions into his songs, telling stories of his struggles and how he had overcome them. It wasn't long before Luca's music began to catch the attention of people in the community. His songs, filled with themes of struggle and triumph, resonated with many who had gone through similar experiences. Luca's music started to be played on local radio stations, and he gained a small following. The more Luca played and sang, the more he felt like he was healing. Music gave him a voice, and through it he began to heal the wounds of his past. Elena couldn't have been prouder of Luca, but he wasn't the only one who changed under her care. Zane, another child Elena had taken in, had also transformed. When Zane first arrived, he was shy and lacked confidence. He didn't believe in himself and often struggled with his schoolwork, but Elena saw the potential in him. She encouraged him to keep trying, and over time, Zane's hard work began to pay off. He became an excellent student and was eventually accepted into one of the best private schools in the country. Today, Zane is at the top of his class, and Elena never would have imagined how far he would go. Nina's story was equally inspiring. Nina had been with Elena for many years, and like Luca and Zane, she had come from a difficult past. Nina had always been passionate about social change, and over time, she began to find ways to make a difference. By the time she was 19, Nina had become a leader at her university. She volunteered for an international NGO, helping others in need. Elena watched with pride as Nina used everything she had learned from her time at Elena's home to help people around the world. Nina's commitment to helping others reminded Elena of the importance of her work, and Elena couldn't have been more proud of the young woman Nina had become. Then, there was Kendi. Elena had taken Kendi in when he was still very young. He had struggled to find his way for a long time, unsure of what he wanted to do with his life. But Elena always believed in him. She supported him as he explored his interests, and one day, Kendi discovered his love for nature. He realized that he wanted to become a tour guide in a national park. Elena encouraged him to follow this dream, and over time, Kendi worked hard to make it a reality. Today, Kendi is a successful tour guide sharing his love of nature with others. Although his path had been different from the others, Elena saw in Kendi the same drive to overcome his past and build a better future. For Elena, these achievements were more than just individual successes. They were proof that, despite the many obstacles these children had faced, they all had the potential to change and build better lives for themselves. From Luca's music to Zane's academic success, from Nina's leadership to Kendi's work in the national park, Elena saw how her efforts had helped them find their paths. Each success, no matter how small, reminded her of why she had chosen this path. Elena knew that her journey would not be easy. Every night, as she lay down in her bed, exhausted from taking care of the children, she would sometimes dream of a different life. A life where she could have biological children of her own, a more traditional family. But deep down, she knew that fate had led her down a different path, one that made her a mother to many, even if none of them shared her blood. She had chosen this life, and while it was filled with sacrifices, she had never regretted her decision. Every child she helped, every life she changed was a victory. The mornings, though chaotic, were what kept Alina going. She woke up early before the children to prepare breakfast. Cooking for so many was never easy, but she did it with love and care. As she sliced bread and boiled water for tea, Alina would reflect on how far they had all come. Her children, as she called them privately, had flourished in ways she never imagined. Despite the difficulties, every little victory reminded her of the importance of her work. Elena didn't just care about their physical needs. She understood that these children carried emotional wounds that couldn't simply be healed by food, shelter, and education. There were days when their past traumas resurfaced, and Elena became more than just a mother. She was a listener, a comforter, and a source of strength for them. Sometimes Elena wondered if these wounds would ever fully heal, but she kept giving them the love they needed, convinced that love could be the key to their recovery. Despite the many challenges, Elena never stopped believing in the power of love. She believed that love could transform lives, and she had seen it happen with her children. Every time one of them thanked her or gave her a hug, Elena knew that all the hard work and sacrifices were worth it. However, there were times when Elena questioned herself. The weight of caring for so many children was heavy. She wondered if she was doing enough, if she could keep going. The fear of failure haunted her at times, and she worried that everything might fall apart. But she always found the strength to keep going, fueled by the love and appreciation she received from the children. Every hug, every word of thanks made her realize that she was doing something meaningful. Elena's efforts were part of a larger battle. She was not just fighting for the children she cared for, but against a system that had failed them. Every time she helped one of her children overcome their challenges, it felt like a small victory against a world that had let them down. Elena knew that her work was not easy, but she was determined to keep going, no matter how hard it became. She would never give up, not on these children and not on the promise she made to herself when she chose this path. Sometimes Elena dreamed of a quieter life, a life where she could have children of her own, but she knew that there was still so much work to do. There were still so many children who needed her, so many lives to change. For now, her priority was her family, the one she had built with love and sacrifice, and as long as she had the strength, Elena would keep fighting for them. Because in the end, Elena believed that love could change everything, and as long as she believed in that, she would never stop fighting for a better future for her children. Thank you for watching. If you like this story and want to see more, please subscribe to our channel. That way you won't miss any new videos. Give us a thumbs up if you enjoyed it and share what you think in the comments. We love hearing your thoughts. Also, don't forget to check out the other videos on our channel. We'll see you in the next story.